Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Back to the politics now, and Cabinet Ministers have been allowed to read the draft Brexit deal, even though it's not quite complete yet. The Ireland border remains the main sticking point, and the Prime Minister is now facing pressure to publish the Attorney General's legal assessment of a deal before ministers decide on whether or not to sign up to it. Well, let's speak to someone who knows a lot about this, as the former Attorney General, Dominic Grieve. He joins us now from Hammersmith in West London. Thank you for being with us this morning, Mr. Grieve.
Good morning.
Now, as a former Attorney General yourself, someone who obviously provided that legal advice to the government, do you think that the Prime Minister should publish the assessment?
It's a difficult issue. I mean, firstly, it's right to say that the Cabinet must see the full legal advice. They're entitled to see it under the Ministerial Code, and it would be quite extraordinary in view of the importance of this matter that they shouldn't see the entire legal advice produced by the attorney. Publishing attorney's advice is more difficult. But the normal rule is that it's not published, it's there so the government can understand every aspect of the issue, and it's not prepared with a view to being published. But if the government doesn't publish it in a matter of this importance, then the government ought to set out very fully its own legal position and publish that with a full explanation of how it sees the legal issues to play out. And that's obviously got to be compatible with the advice that the Attorney General has given.
I mean, some of our viewers will be listening to you thinking, I don't understand, why can't they just be open? Shouldn't they just publish the full legal assessment so MPs can make up their own minds? I mean, what are the arguments against actually publishing it?
The arguments against publishing it is that a legal advice is prepared for the purpose of advising the client, who in this case is the government and the Cabinet collectively, and is likely to contain a discussion as much as a final position. And you've got to understand that with any legal advice, there are always potentially two sides to an argument that can be put forward. And if the attorney is doing his job properly, he will highlight all those points. But that doesn't make it improper for the government to come down on one side or another of that argument and take it as the government's position. Now, I entirely accept that in view of the importance of this issue, and it really is important, that there could be an argument that one could put forward that it would be sensible for the advice to be published. But as I say, I am also respectful of the fact that attorneys do not produce advice for the purposes of publication, and it's undesirable in some ways that that should happen, because otherwise we're going to have attorneys tempted to tailor the advice as if it were for publication, and that's something which no legal advisor must do.
And perhaps, as you say, not being quite as open as they would be otherwise if they knew that the advice was going to be published. What are the rules here? Could the government get away with just publishing a summary of the advice, for example? Or if they decided to publish something, do they have to publish the whole thing?
They could certainly publish a summary. The other option is actually to publish the government's legal position. That's to say, it can be quite a full document setting out any arguments the government wishes, but it's the government's collective position. It's important to understand this, not the attorney's advice to the government. The attorney provides advice, and then the government decides what it considers collectively the legal position it wishes to adhere to or to put over should be. And that's how it's normally done. As I say, this is a very difficult issue, because I have no doubt that the issue of the Irish backstop is going to be critical in deciding whether the United Kingdom has or hasn't got some sort of acceptable deal.
Well, let's talk about that, shall we? What would constitute an acceptable deal when it comes to the backstop? At the minute, it seems as if we're talking about the idea of the whole of the UK remaining in a customs union with the EU. Is that something that you could vote for?
It doesn't make me particularly comfortable, because it's so markedly less good than staying in the European Union. This has always been the difficulty. The problem we have with the whole of Brexit in a nutshell is that unless you believe in the vision which some of my colleagues espouse about the UK's future wholly removed from the EU, its regulations and tariffs, which I happen to think would destroy our manufacturing industry, create hundreds of thousands of unemployed people and be catastrophic for our country, unless you believe in that vision, then actually every option that the government has been exploring over the last two years and trying to negotiate involves some sort of remaining dependency and relationship with the EU, which appears to be, frankly, rather less good than staying in the European Union, where you have influence and actually can create the rules. We're going to become rule takers in some areas and not rule makers. And that's the key issue. Now, if you're content that you should be a rule taker over a customs union, then staying in a customs union long term has certain advantages, although I'm blown to think what they are compared to staying in the European Union itself. But of course, if on top of that we have a backstop issue that we have got to deal with, which is a real problem, then there is a risk that the Irish backstop may prevent us from ever leaving a customs union thereafter. And so that is a material consideration that the government has got to take into account and the public have got to understand. And the Irish backstop is about Northern Ireland. But for most of us as parliamentarians at Westminster, the idea of carving Northern Ireland off economically from the rest of the United Kingdom, as long as it's in union with us, is completely unacceptable. And I could never vote for it, ever. It's very, very simple. It is an impossibility for me, as a Conservative Member of Parliament and a unionist, to have an arrangement which could mean that eventually Northern Ireland is carved out economically from the UK.
OK, so you're very clear there, saying that you won't vote for anything where Northern Ireland is carved out from the rest of the UK. But what about this backstop issue? What about the idea of the UK staying in a customs union with the EU? Is that something that you could support, even though you admit that it makes you uncomfortable?
I would much prefer, if we are going down that road, that we should put this to the British public in a further referendum, because I think it's very different from what was being talked about when we held our referendum in 2016. And people have got to understand what the long-term consequences are of the United Kingdom having a dependency relationship on a large trading bloc where we have decided quite voluntarily to leave it and to abandon our influence and ability to develop it collectively with our European Union partners.
Another referendum may not be on the table.
But I will say that
another referendum may not be on the table.
Well, I'm not so sure. Well, a referendum is on the table if Parliament decides it wishes to have one. Of course it's on the table if Parliament wishes to have one. If Parliament wishes to have one, the government's going to have to hold one.
If Parliament wishes to have one, though? Are you confident that Parliament does?
That is, absolutely. Well, there is always the possibility that Parliament doesn't want to have one. And if Parliament doesn't want to have one, we're going to leave the EU on the 29th of March. And yes, I mean, as a responsible parliamentarian, I'm going to have to make a decision about which arrangement is best for the United Kingdom after we've gone. But from my personal point of view, and trying to do my best in the national interest, each one of the options on offer is less good than remaining in the European Union. And I'm very concerned that what we're actually going to do is to get a deal, leave the EU on the 29th of March, and in 2 years, nobody is going to thank us for what we've done. And I think this is an extraordinary state of affairs. And we as parliamentarians have a responsibility to try to manage this process, respecting what was indicated to us by a majority of the British public 2 years ago, but not completely closing down the options and failing to respond to the obvious problems and challenges we've now got in leaving. And it seems to me it's pretty logical in those circumstances to go back to people and say, is this what you really want? If it is what they really want, well, so be it. I will never raise the subject again. It will be over and done with. But to go and put the United Kingdom in what I think is a position of dependency, which is much less good than the current arrangements, is for me a rather difficult thing to do. And it's something which I'm not going to do without debate with my colleagues and trying to persuade them to go back and ask the public, do you want this?
OK, Dominic Reeve, thank you very much. So the Prime Minister is facing pressure to publish legal advice about the proposed Brexit deal. Some Brexit backers have suggested that the Attorney General's advice should be made public. Well, we're joined now by the chairman and founder of Cobra Beer, Lord Karan Billamoria, who supported a Remain vote, the Reigate MP Crispin Blunt, who campaigned to leave the EU, and Ali Renison, the head of Europe and Trade Policy at the Institute of Directors. and thank you all for being with us. Lots to discuss. It feels as if perhaps we are edging slightly closer to a deal. I mean, it feels like we've been here before. Question blunt, do you think that the deal is on the cards? Is it in touching distance?
I'm fairly certain something's going to be presented to the Cabinet fairly shortly, and it looks as the choreography looks as though they'll have a special summit in November. That's what it feels like. But obviously, for the whole of this is actually not only the withdrawal agreement, which is actually what's going to be presented, you've got the transition period, but the most important thing is of course, the what could only at this stage be a political commitment to the long-term partnership, and we have no idea at this stage what that looks like.
I mean, I guess that's it, isn't it? Getting a deal is one thing. Whether or not it's a good deal is a completely different question.
Yes, we've got to remember that people were given 4 months to make a decision about a hugely complicated issue, over 40 years old at that time. It's now 45 years since we joined the European Union, in effect. And it's so complicated that here we are 2.5 years after the referendum, where we're told this will be the easiest deal in history. We can't even agree the withdrawal deal, let alone we still don't know what the future partnership is going to look like yet. And we've got stuck on the withdrawal deal. The money, 39 billion, that's been sorted out. The people supposedly has been sorted out. And now we're stuck with the Achilles heel of Brexit, which is Northern Ireland. And you cannot square that circle. Why? The Good Friday Agreement. 20 years old now, that is precious. And the Good Friday Agreement is north-south in Ireland and east-west between the whole island of Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom.
Now,
if you to square that circle, we are jeopardizing the whole of the Good Friday Agreement. And logically, again, if we leave on a hard Brexit, which is not an option, by the way, the Parliament will not accept that, public will not accept that. If we leave on a hard Brexit, how can you not have a hard border in Ireland? Because otherwise you have free movement from the rest of the 26 countries coming into Ireland, walking into the United Kingdom. I mean, where's the control of borders? Europe is never going to agree to that, so this is illogical. We cannot square the circle, so therefore we need to have complete the whole public.
I can see you chomping at the bit to come back.
Because actually the answer is terribly obvious. If we do end up with no agreement, and we go through the process which we have initiated by giving notice, we're going to be left with that problem with the border. And both sides, strange enough, are going to have to sit down and work out how to make sure that, one, you do not put a concrete wall all the way along the border, which is obviously practically physically impossible, and you deal with the issues you've got to deal with, which is to keep the European Customs Union working properly, and our Customs Union working properly, and our single market working properly.
We've spent so long, haven't we, over the last 2 years speaking about the island border. I know it's important.
But you would do. But the critical thing is here: if we are pitched into that position, where Humpty Dumpty's won, and we've got to put Humpty Dumpty back together again on the border and all sorts of other issues. All sorts of other issues. We will sit down, hopefully like grown-ups, and have the negotiations to enable it to happen sensibly.
Let's go back to the central point, shall we, about whether or not a Brexit deal is around the corner, and if you think it will be a good one if it happens.
Yeah, and I think we have to remember that the critical thing, the most important thing actually at this stage is not the future relationship. That's not what the vote is predominantly going to be about. The binding text is going to be about the withdrawal agreement. And that is the most important thing to get an agreement on and to get through the House of Commons and obviously the House of Lords as well. That is existential because it is the first step in the process of Brexit. Once we are out of the EU, legally, you heard the Prime Minister talk about this in her Florence speech, only then can you actually negotiate the future relationship.
Absolutely not. I'm sorry.
That's the legal requirements
not
under
at all.
Article 50.
Not at all. Under Article 50, you have to have a very clear idea of what the future relationship is going to look like.
A framework. It's not a legal text.
There is no framework at all at the moment. And a blind Brexit, are you prepared for us to go into a blind Brexit where we agree this withdrawal agreement now, and then we go and we don't know what's going to happen in the future?
But that is the function of what Article 50 is about. It talks about setting out the terms of the exit deal and having a framework. Only when you are out of the EU can you legally actually do the trade agreement for the future.
At the moment, there's no framework at all either.
Well, because it hasn't come back at this stage
Everyone's accepted that it would be a political declaration about the future. But everyone will accept that that is a binding political declaration on the governments that make it. And
how much detail we get is left to be
and will have to be delivered. And people are talking about a 50-page document, apparently, we're going to be presented with what the future agreement will look. Now, and none of us know this because we're all waiting to see what we're presented with. But for the British, it's always been the case that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, because for us, the most important thing is the long-term relationship and the transition period to make sure that we've got the time to prepare properly for it. And that's why we're paying the £39 billion. The bulk of that money is about supporting the budget, European budget, in that period of the transition. But if we're not going to get a long-term deal, and if we're, then why are we going to pay this money for the transition?
Now, I can't resist but show everyone and play again the doorstep of David Cameron that we did yesterday, because it's someone who perhaps is more responsible than anybody for bringing about the referendum. So let's have a little listen to what he had to say.
I'm on my way to the Treasury now. I fully support what she's doing. Want to let her get on with the job.
Do you think it's acceptable that David Cameron has been so silent in this debate?
Well, I think I'd pick up on the last part of what he said, that he thinks it's important for him to let the Prime Minister get on with doing it. I know that there are these sort of arguments about whether he should have stepped away so quickly, whether he should take a view on what's happening at the moment. I think those things are slightly academic at this stage.
The reality is this: we can talk as much about the legalities of the withdrawal agreement versus the future framework. The reality is that we are in a position here where what we're heading into is not the best option. This is not the best option for the country. We're now stuck with the Remain has lost and Leave has won, and we've got to implement the will of the people. What about all the youngsters? I've got 2 of my children who will be old enough to vote by March next year. One is already old enough to vote. They didn't get a say. It's their future. The demographics have changed. The world has changed. We were the fastest growing economy in the world before the referendum. We're now one of the slowest in the G7. Our growth rates for the next 5 years, the lowest predicted in history, of less than 2% a year for the next 5 years. And the uncertainty. We have this uncertainty of a withdrawal of a blind Brexit. I mean, how can we leave business and our citizens and our country in this situation?
From a business perspective, when I go around the country and talk to all of our members in different parts of the UK, the first thing they ask is, are we going to get a deal? And if the counterfactual is a risk of no deal, you may have a view about whether that's a bluff or not. Their preference is to have a deal get through.
There will not be, because there will be.
Chris Wimberland, as someone who backed Leave, how comfortable are you with what is currently on the table with the backstop? This idea, perhaps,
we should never have conceded the language last December about the backstop. The idea that 0.2% of our GDP, I think, is trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, that somehow we were going to allow the entire arrangement to hang on that is a nonsense.
I mean, do you think we could be ending up in an endless customs union?
Well, the whole thing, in sense about the Northern Ireland border, is a nonsense, because it is a complicated, difficult border, which in any agreement is going to be very difficult to address in the kind of legalese that the European Union normally insist on in these kinds of trade arrangements. So you're going to have to. So you're going to have. So you're going to have. So you're going to. Wait. Hang on.
That is so insensitive. I mean, this is 20 years.
Stop, Karen. And so you are going to need, effectively, a protocol attached to any treaty that is going to need to deal with the complexity of that border and the special arrangements that would have to be put in place to make sure that things like the Good Friday Agreement...
But that would happen under the future relationship. I think part of the problem with the backstop now is, even if there is this sort of UK-wide customs arrangement, suddenly you're trying to build in the future relationship into the backstop, and that's not the purpose of the backstop. So I think all of those details are going to be really sorted out, not in the next 3 weeks, but once we get to that next relationship.
One last point. We have to have the option of remaining, by the way. That is an option still, of remaining and having a people's vote. And that is very much the best democracy we can have, is to give the people the final say on the situation.
The Remainers are still fighting a referendum.
Thank you very much. We are out of time. I don't think I've ever been needed less in a debate. I think just let you all just go for it without being here at all. Thank you very much.